Hello, everyone. It's very good to welcome everyone to this very interesting topic or set of topics. Is democracy for sale? The neoliberalism's order's final act. But before welcoming you all more fully, let me acknowledge country. It's appropriate that I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where we are now gathered. Well, at least most of us are gathered, Australia, the land we call Australia. We pay our respects to past, present, and future elders and recognize the unique connection of the First Nations to country and their role in caring for and maintaining country over tens of thousands of years. May long overdue justice be done to them, and may their wisdom and resilience be with us on this auspicious occasion when we are dealing with issues which are crucial, not least to the well-being of the First Nations. I know we have people joining us from different parts of Australia and from some other countries, and we welcome you all, regardless of the time that you are joining us. In some cases, rather ungodly hours, either very early morning or very late in the evening. For those of you who are joining us, let's say, from New Zealand. The issues, democracy, the economic order, which we've had for the best part of 40 or more years, are crucial issues because they raise fundamental questions about whether or not our institutions, economic, political, and in some sense cultural, are fit for purpose. As we scan different parts of the world, we see a host of challenges, and in most cases, the responses are at best feeble. Whether we are looking at climate change or the wars raging in different parts of the world, not least in Gaza and Ukraine, but also civil wars of extraordinary scale, inflicting terrible pain and suffering on huge numbers of people, for example, in Sudan. But whether we're thinking of a number of other issues, be it the mental health epidemic in many parts of the Western world and beyond, whether we're thinking of the impact of the so-called mainstream media and social media on people's knowledge and understanding of what's happening around the world, and so many other issues which are fundamentally unresolved, host of environmental and social ailments that we are hardly dealing with. It comes back to the way economic activity is structured and to the way the governance and political decision-making occurs. And so these are the fundamental questions we want to explore. And it is worth saying, I think, that there are millions of people around the world who are beavering away on trying to make a bit of a difference on one or other of the many issues I'm referring to. But while there is a tendency on the part of large numbers to become committed and engaged on this issue or that issue, trying to change policy direction, there is much less focus on the institutional underpinning, which produce policies that are often either beside the point or have totally adverse consequences. And many of these institutions are economic or political processes, institutional, structural power, very, very effectively executed and pursued interests that are often inimical to the public good. So it is with some of these underlying questions that we want to address on this particular occasion. And we're going to have if I may, just sketch for you what we're going to do. We have our two guests, Professor John Quiggin and Professor John Keane, and we're going to ask them to address us briefly to begin with for some opening remarks. And then we're going to enter into a conversation, which I'm sure will be both interesting and animated, arising in part from their opening remarks, but perhaps going beyond them to deal with a number of other issues, related issues. And then we'll open it up to Q&A. And at some point in the proceedings, we're going to have, towards the end of the event, we're going to have two quick polls just to test the mood of those attending on a couple of key questions of particular interest to Conversation at the Crossroads, which of course is hosting this event as part of its program, and will have a bit more to say, not a lot more, but a little more to say about its program in the course of the next hour and a half or so. So let me now go on to introduce Professor John Quiggin. He's Professor of Economics at the University of Queensland, a prominent research economist and a commentator on economic policy and politics, a fellow of the Econometric Society, the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia, and other learned societies. He's authored and edited many books, many refereed journal articles in such fields as environmental economics, production economics, the theory of economic growth, and much else. He's written on such areas of policy as climate change, microeconomic reform, privatisation, employment policy, and, as I've said, much else. Recent books include After Neoliberalism, Public Policy and Climate Change, and Western Welfare Capitalism in Good Times and Bad. So it's over to you, John. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Joe. I always have the same background, so I acknowledge the Jagera and Turrbal peoples, who are the traditional owners of the land on which the University of Queensland stands. I'm not there right at the moment, but that's I always carry that with me. So I want to start with this term neoliberalism, and there's no doubt that it's used fairly widely as a general pejorative. The other day, I was commenting on the fiasco to do with Creative Australia and made the remark that the very fact that it had been renamed from the Australia Council to Creative Australia, in line with many other things, was typical of neoliberalism. Well, that it is in a sense, but clearly not at the core. But this kind of broad use of bad things that have happened in the last 40 years have led particularly neoliberals to say this is just a meaningless term of abuse. From their point of view, people using this term are just attacking common sense public policy. My observation there is that ideology always looks like common sense from the inside. So it's only at the end of the neoliberal period that we can really take a clear view of what it is, why it was so powerful and why it has failed. So first it emerges really, although you can trace history back a long way, emerges really in the 1970s with the economic crisis of that time, when what it seemed like inevitable march towards a more equal society in which governments played a bigger role in providing goods and services, ensuring that everybody got a fair go and so forth, that was replaced quite rapidly by an opposite ideology saying that role of government needs to be kept to the absolute minimum. What we need in society is competition, and particularly and consumer choice. And the best way to deliver that is ideally through private for-profit enterprise. The best way to decide which enterprises should be backed is through capital markets, stock markets, bond markets, and so forth. And so this process, referred to in Australia by its advocates as microeconomic reform, by its critics mostly as economic rationalism, was the absolutely dominant view in the 1980s and 1990s under the Hawke, Keating and Howard governments. And so we saw lots of privatisation, deregulation, to the extent we had ministers for deregulation, the removal of various kinds of intervention in the economy, and not coincidentally, a big growth in inequality in Australia and elsewhere. And so what happened in Australia was, broadly speaking, typical of what happened everywhere in the world, starting and going furthest in what's called the Anglosphere. We were very much influenced by the UK, but Australia was perhaps the first country to adopt what was so-called the third way, undertaken by people like Blair and Clinton, an attempt to maintain much of the welfare state that made social democracy, before neoliberalism, the kind of ideology that prevailed essentially from the end of World War II to the 1970s, preserve that social welfare safety net while essentially getting government out of the business of running the economy. So that process, as I say, reached its dominance, particularly in the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, appeared to demonstrate that there was no real alternative. And what we saw in this period was a political alternation between two versions I've described: the kind of hard neoliberalism associated with Margaret Thatcher, and the soft neoliberalism associated with Tony Blair, Hawke, Keating, and so forth. And so, in terms of the political process, everything outside that was consigned to the fringes. So anybody who adhered to the traditional kinds of views of the Labor Party was dismissed as outdated and irrelevant. The Greens were kept on the margins. At the other side, other end of the political spectrum, a whole bunch of particularly older and rural voters, but not only them, who weren't at all interested in the ideas of choice and competition, liked the idea of governments doing things, but wanted governments to do things for their kind of people rather than for people of the wrong colour or the wrong religion or sexual persuasion or so forth. All of these views were kept on the fringes as long as the economy seemed to be performing well. And during the 1990s, particularly in the US, it was performing stunningly well. And so we had a whole bunch of literature. Essentially, Thomas Friedman, who wrote the New York Times, was sort of the airport bestseller version of this, saying everything is going to be great as long as we do these things, and as long as we can leave the central bank to run the economy, and everything will go smoothly. And this had a bit of a hiccup around the turn of the century with a big dot-com bubble and bust in the US and elsewhere, and with a bunch of financial crises which were more or less successfully resolved, but really are papered over. So it was really only with the global financial crisis of 2008 that the wheels started coming off this process. By this stage, the people running the show weren't the sort of people who had been enthusiastic converts in the late 1970s and 80s. They were people who didn't really have much else in mind. Didn't have any alternatives to think of, just thought of this as the way that things had always been done, but were rapidly forced to take emergency measures, big financial stimulus and so forth in the crisis. And as this process continued, public disillusionment with the kinds of policy achievements of neoliberalism grew. And that's particularly true in the case of privatisation. That was the signature policy of the Thatcher government, seemed to be very much the way of the future, was endorsed by the World Bank, the IMF and so forth. The only problem was that it didn't deliver the goods. It made owners of privatised assets very wealthy, but didn't deliver the improved services that people were expecting, didn't deliver lower prices. What we saw was, although there were significant reductions in employment in areas like the electricity industry, all the productive workers who were laid off were replaced by marketers, accountants, financial manipulators, and so forth. And so we've seen that breakdown occurring. In Australia in particular, we no longer hear anybody, even the Conservative parties, talking about privatisation under that name. We occasionally see Victorian state government is particularly bad in this respect. Various sell-offs of essentially taxation functions of government, things like the Lands Titles Office, births, deaths and marriages, which are essentially contracting out government services under very unfavourable terms. But the idea of selling off basic infrastructure has pretty much gone out because these policies have failed. Similarly, no one very much cares anymore about the idea that that bond markets, financial markets, the judgments of these markets represent the crucial assessment of whether governments are doing a good or bad job. In the financial crisis, these institutions gave incredibly high ratings to securities, which turned out to be worthless, and we now see entirely spurious things like Bitcoin operating in financial markets, companies like Tesla, which ought to be worthless, selling for trillions of dollars and so forth. And so no one anymore thinks of financial markets as particularly sensible. They're still powerful and out there, but they're important. Now, certainly at the time of the crisis, I hope we would see better things come out of it politically. We've certainly seen, as I say, a movement away from the signature policies of neoliberalism, but most of that has gone in the direction of crony capitalism. And really, Trump, of course, is the extreme illustration of this. And that's been associated with very poisonous culture war politics with which we're all familiar. Tracing this back, what features of neoliberalism produced this? Well, I think the biggest single one was one that's the theme of our talk tonight, which is that neoliberalism allowed the development of a class of incredibly wealthy people who use their wealth to influence political power. That's very obviously true in the US. We can name the right names in Australia, and they've been powerful, but on the whole, we've had, they haven't been nearly as successful here as they have been not only in the US, in many other countries, people like Berlusconi, for example, in Italy and so forth. And the various backers of the Brexit movement in the UK, a bunch of mostly chancellors who made large fortunes and were prepared to use that to indulge their political preferences. So the growth in inequality, I think, has been a feature of neoliberalism, not in some sense an intended one. That is, they were sort of relaxed about it, but they imagined that the more or less equal society of the post-war period would continue with the advent of more competition, choice, and so forth. That this would not be the result would not be to hand over all the wealth of the country to a tiny group of people, but that's what's happened, and that's been, I think, the driving political force. As in Australia, what we've seen as part of this process is that this neoliberal consensus, largely shared still by the two big parties, or the one party and one coalition, that's gradually lost support to the point where these large parties can barely get 30% of the vote, and even so are themselves moving away from this consensus. So we're seeing very much a willingness to intervene in the economy, but no coherent idea of what should be done. And so the world is in this state of flux, during which there is the great danger of someone like Trump taking over, as has happened in the US. And although this is maybe stepping slightly beyond the theme of the talk, very clearly the challenge for Australia and other countries over the next large number of years is how to disengage in many crucial respects from a US-centered economy, a US so-called rules-based order in which the US was both the primary creator of the rules, a beneficiary, but nonetheless somebody who mostly played by those rules, to one in which we have to deal with a whole bunch of countries with which even the term transactional is overly favourable. That is, we can make a deal with them, but they won't stick to it. We have to find ways of dealing with a world in which the world economy no longer works, either in the way that the neoliberals hoped it would, or anything like what it, in its most successful period, the social democratic period after 1945. So I'll leave it there and hand to John Kay.
Thank you very much, John. Can you hear me well?
I can hear you, certainly.
I'm sorry, John. I was muted for a moment. I will introduce you just in a second.
Okay.
I just wanted to thank John for his wonderful sketch of a very complex and substantial period of history and where that has led us to this point in time. Of course, we'll come back to many of the questions that John Quiggin raised in those opening remarks. Well, now we want to turn the floor over to John Keane, who is professor at the University of Sydney, very well known for his contribution over many years. He founded the London-based Centre for the Study of Democracy and later directed the Sydney Democracy Network, recently designed and launched the global platform Democracy Lighthouse. I encourage people to have a quick look at the website. For 2 decades, he was Distinguished Research Professor at the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin, the author of many books, translated in more than several dozen languages. Recent books include The Shortest History of Democracy, a very interesting overview of what's happening in many parts of the so-called democratic world, or not so democratic, and Thinking About Democracy in Turbulent Times, Sorbonne Lectures. He has frequently contributed to New York Times, The Guardian, and several other international media. So it's a great pleasure to have you with us, John Keane. Please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Joe. It's a great pleasure to be with you again after so many years. Thank you very much for the invitation to meet Conversation at the Crossroads people. And thank you too for John Q for his opening remarks about neoliberalism. I was very intrigued, Joe, by your second title, Neoliberalism's Final Act. It has a certain tragic quality. And I wanted to therefore say right at the beginning that this is one of these strange historical periods. They don't often happen more than once or twice in one's life, normally, in which so many things are happening that are actually senseless, that one gets the feeling that there are too many things to try to grasp, and actually some things seem to be beyond our capacity to think. And when we're trying to make sense, therefore, of this period, I would say it's very important for us to have a strong measure of humility. I mean, we are not God or gods. We don't know the future. But what we can do is actually look in to the depths of the present, so to say. And it's important, I think, to do that in any discussion of neoliberalism and its long-term impact on democracy in particular, and to distinguish between some short-term trends and some deeper structural trends. Short-term trends, there was several months ago an attempt at coup d'etat in South Korea. It was defeated. Just a month ago, Karol Nawrocki won the presidential election in Poland under the slogan of Save Poland. He's a demagogue. There are other short-term trends, including, for example, the stifling of dissent that's going on in universities for one reason or another, in particular by those who lobby in favor of crushing all conversation about Israel and its crimes. But there are long-term trends, structural trends, and I want to, there are many of them that are driving the sense that democracy is in crisis. There is a lot of talk of democide, of backsliding of democracy, and so on. I would say that among the most important deep-seated strands of our present period that have implications for the future and will and need to be addressed in order to make sense of whether this is neoliberalism's final act. And I want to talk about three of them briefly in the 6 minutes or so that I have left. One of them is the clear growth of citizen disaffection with political parties, governments, with politics, and with democracy. It's the soil, this disaffection, I want to suggest to you, is the soil in which demagogues rise again, once again, in democracies. And I want to talk about what those demagogues are doing to democracy. There is a second deep-seated trend. This is more controversial, in which it does seem to me that the writing is on the wall of the American empire. We're witnessing, live streamed on media, the decline of an empire. And I want to suggest to you that this second trend, which is bound up with neoliberalism, is having all kinds of pathological consequences on democracy and presenting challenges to actually existing democracies that they've not known since probably the 1920s or 30s. And a third challenge, I want to talk about the Earth's revenge on democracy. It's not so widely discussed, but I want to suggest to you that neoliberalism had very serious ecological consequences, which are having long-term, mostly damaging effects on democracy, its spirit, and its substance. So these are the three themes, and I'll be very brief, and please, Joe, guillotine me if I go over time. On disaffection, the evidence is clear from most democracies. There is anxiety among many citizens about the growing gap between rich and poor. John already mentioned this. There are events like January the 6th or the assault on various institutions in Brazil at the end of the Jair Bolsonaro period. Quite recently, a survey of young people in Europe, it's very revealing, by the TWE group, showed that among Generation Z, this disaffection is rising. Only half of Generation Z young people in France and Spain think that democracy is a good way of handling power. And the figure is even lower than that in Poland. Around 1/5 of Generation Z respondents say that they think that some kind of authoritarian, strong-armed rule government would be okay. This is symptomatic of this wider disaffection. And there are many drivers of this, but what I want to point out, perhaps a little less obvious on this disaffection point, is that this disaffection has, if you like, an autoimmune disease quality to it. Democracy promises greater equality among citizens, an improvement in their life chances. It promises that the abuse of power will be stopped. But when millions of citizens feel, they come to the conclusion that this is not so, this has everything to do with what the French call ressentiment. You know, this sense that democracy promises us equalization of life chances, dignity, and so on. It robs us of this, and therefore the disaffection is the soil in which I would say it's one of the poisonous fruits of neoliberalism. We witness the rise of demagogues. They are an old phenomenon in the history of democracy, beginning with the ancient Greek world. But we all know about the Bolsonaros and the Le Pens and the Dutertes and the Orbans and the Millets and the AMLOs, the Thaksin Shinawats, the Geert Wilders, and of course Trump. And I'm writing at the moment about the consequences of the rise of demagogues. And one clear trend, it seems to me, is that for various reasons that are rooted in local context, generally what they do is push democracies in the direction of something like despotic rule. They dream of neutering judiciaries. They want to politicize the public service. They take over the police intelligence services. They neuter parliaments. And of course, they do everything to get rid of what they call fake news, or what Modi in India calls prostitutes. That means journalists you don't like. And the net consequence is that lawlessness, corruption, the kind of a permanent emergency rule of arbitrary power becomes the norm in the hands of these demagogues. This is the first, it seems to me, very roughly sketched, put in a very bowdlerized way. This is the first poisonous fruit of neoliberalism. The second is that the United States, as we know, was the champion, the linchpin, so to say, of this 40-year neoliberal period that John has already spoken about. The writing, it seems to me, is on the wall. It's a long discussion. I hope we'll have time to talk about it. But there are symptoms of decline of a global empire that was dominant after 1945, and for a brief period after the collapse of the Soviet Union was the unipolar empire. The writing on the wall is becoming clearer, it seems to me. And contrary to what some of the ardent fans of Trump are saying, you know, that in his presidential address, inaugural address, he announced that there will be a big and very beautiful period coming for the United States, and that there will be a recovery from decline. Contrary to this view, it seems to me the decline is deeply structural. It's partly to do with the rise of China and China's outflanking of the United States on many, many fronts. It's partly to do with the declining legitimacy of the American empire. I'm old enough to remember the period when the United States was Elvis Presley and Marilyn Monroe, and it was Bob Dylan, and it was the Beach Boys, and so on. There hardly are any equivalents today that attract great global enthusiasm for the United States, culturally speaking. In that period, earlier in my life, there was always, even during the darkest moments, the belief that the United States could be made better again. That feeling, I think, is radically in decline. And of course, there is another symptom of the decline of empire. Montesquieu captured it. It is the permanent militarization of this empire, constantly at war. It's a sign of weakness. And if I'm right about this decline of the American empire, about which I've been writing recently, then this has serious implications for democracy. You've probably noticed that Trump, for example, in the tariffs policy, doesn't give a fig about whether a state is democratic or not. There is not only a serious degradation of democracy going on at home, institutionally speaking, in the United States, but there is, as the Canadians have discovered, there is a kind of disregard of the spirit and substance and rules of democracy when the United States is dealing with its former allies. And what I would say, if I had more time, is that actually this is a repeat in a way, but under very different circumstances, of the 1930s and 40s, when democracies that survived, there were only 11 left in 1941. The democracies that survived because they kept their distance from the clashing empires. And one of the great questions, it seems to me, for democracy is whether it can survive in post-imperial form. Is it possible for democracies to band together in new ways? Can there be a kind of solidarity of the shaken, as Jan Patočka, the Czech philosopher, liked to say? Can democracies, can its spirit and substance be preserved by democracies banding together in new ways and not relying, not supposing that they can and should rely on the United States? Finally, if I may, Joe, I want to say something about the ecological consequences of neoliberalism. John correctly has pointed out that privatization, marketization, the lifting of restrictions on investment and so-called development projects, mega projects of various kinds, was central to the whole substance of and spirit of neoliberalism. Well, we now know in retrospect that this has had serious environmental consequences of all kinds. The roots are much deeper, of course. I'm thinking here of the great work of Amitav Ghosh, who speaks about the great derangement as one of the products of neoliberalism. We're witnessing all kinds of eco problems and catastrophes that have damaging effects on democracy. Fukushima is a symbol, and I've tried to write that the Fukushima nuclear accident was actually a symptom of democracy failure. The lack of accountability in large and dangerous and risky projects can produce catastrophes. It's also clear that the various eco-destructive trends that we're witnessing are producing emergencies, extreme weather events that produce great flooding of the Pakistan kind, the largest and most destructive ever recorded, in which people are herded by police and army. There is a suspension of all rights. The normalization of these emergencies should worry us. And finally, in terms of the revenge of the earth on democracy, one could say that actually there are damaging consequences of eco-destruction on the very spirit of democracy. Think of Rachel Carson and her case, the case that she made for wonder as a very important quality of democracy. The more species we destroy, the more our sense of wonder about the complexity of the world and a world that we didn't make is endangered. And there are other effects of eco-destruction. I'm thinking, for instance, of an Australian philosopher, Glenn Albrecht, who speaks about solastalgia. You know, this sense when you lose an ecosystem, this sense of loss, of mourning that runs very deep. Well, my idea, put not very clearly in this third trend, this third poisonous gift of neoliberalism, my idea is that eco-catastrophes, extreme weather events, the destruction of species, and so on, are having damaging effects on democracy. And the rhythm of the impact of these events is slow, but it may be that one of the long-term consequences, it's a very dark thought. There are many counter trends, which I hope we can discuss, but one of the long-term consequences of neoliberalism was to accelerate eco-destruction and the proliferation of challenges to democracy, for instance, in the form of the normalization of emergency rule. I think it's enough from me. There are many positive things to be said, but these at least seem to me to be the gifts of neoliberalism to democracy. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much for raising three in fairly provocative fashion, which in the good sense of the word, three gifts, as you've called them, poisonous gifts, but nevertheless offshoots of the neoliberal order. Now, that leads me to a question addressed to both of you, which concerns me, which intrigues me, and I'm sure many others. And this is, okay, neoliberalism may no longer be at its high point. There's increasing disaffection with what it has produced. But, and John Q alluded to this. Is anything replacing it, or is it just a few ad hoc responses which don't yet add up to a great deal? In other words, is Trumpism, a kind of sequel to neoliberalism, or is it something else, or is it that we just don't know and it's early days? In other words, have we left it behind or not quite? We understand the consequences of what used to be, but is anyone or any interest or any structure or any institution pointing in a direction which is different from what we came to know as the neoliberal order at its height? Perhaps John Q to begin with.
Yeah. No, I think at the moment we have been really floundering for the 15 years or so, 17 years since the global financial crisis. What we see, I think, is a political class that's still in the grip of a bunch of neoliberal concerns, worries about, worries about debt and deficits and so forth, that they have been, we've seen, particularly from the Albanese government, a huge amount of effort to design interventions that meet social needs, but somehow or other don't appear in the budget balance, don't appear as debt. I mean, to take just one example relevant to people in the university sector, looking at the problems of the sector, you'd ask the question, why is it that we're rushing to reduce the debts of people who've already graduated, most of whom, not all, but most of whom have made a reasonably good start in life, while maintaining the Liberal government's appalling job-ready graduates' fee charges, which are doing incredible damage? The answer is that as far as I can tell, the student debt never appeared on the government's books, so they can just cross it off. I mean, it is, of course, money they were going to collect, and they're not. It's real money, but the accounting conventions mean it never appeared as part of the government's public debt, and so they can just cross it out without incurring any consequences that are reported in the budget. By contrast, if they fixed the university fee structure, it would almost certainly mean less fee income for the universities, which in turn would mean that the government had to put in more money, and so they haven't done it. And so I think that's kind of reflects very much the state of the current government, that they know we need to do something, but they're trapped in a combination of, we can't raise the ratio of tax to GDP, we can't, we've exhausted all the financial expedients like asset sales, and so we're trying all these dodgy schemes. The Housing Australia Future Fund, again, was another example of the same kind of process, where the attempt was to magic up tens of thousands of houses without any actual outlay of public money. So I think that's the kind of situation that's the good side of the story in a sense, because the bad side is that you turn to people like Trump to fake remedies like Brexit and so forth. And of course, they're not worried in the slightest about deficits or debt or any of those things. Trump's just added another trillion or two to the US public debt, and no one cares at all. And what they do is just keep, well, at this point, it's not even business keeping the troops happy with culture war. Really, culture war has taken over, and business is just trying to pick up what it can from a government that is essentially motivated by pushing those culture war issues. And the space for that has been created essentially by the collapse of right-wing hard neoliberal parties. Their stance no longer appeals to anybody, and so essentially, whereas for a long while they were relying on the votes of culture war while delivering neoliberal policies, now they've been swallowed by the tiger they were trying to ride.
Any thoughts, John? John Kay? You're muted. John, I think you're still, that's it.
Yes, I have a few thoughts, Joe. I think this drift that John has just described is one which has already some identifiable characteristics. I think the flourishing of arbitrary power seems to me to be a striking feature of this period. There's a certain brutality and normlessness that's settling on various parts of the world, and we ought to be deeply worried about this trend. Trumpism is, of course, a manifestation of this flourishing of arbitrary power. The way the administration operates at home is the way it's operating abroad. So, on the first day of the second presidency, the United States withdraws from the WHO. It abandons the Paris Accord and so on. This is also, I would say, a period in which there's not only the flourishing of arbitrary power and violence, but it's also a period in which something of historic significance. I've written a book on it. It's the so-called rise of China. I think the emergence of a new empire of a kind that we've never witnessed before. And I hope we could talk more about it. But very clearly, there is now a competitor power of the United States. It's a power which economically is outflanking the United States on more than a few fronts. It is a power that has the four largest banks in the world, that in matters of AI and robotics, electric vehicles, is a serious competitor to that of the United States. But it does more than economically muscle its way into the world. It's also, curiously, an emerging empire, in my view, that is practicing new forms of diplomacy. It wants to strengthen cross-border institutions, partly by building its own, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, partly by building parallel flanking institutions to that of the United States. The AIIB Bank would be an instance. And partly by building up its own institutions like the People's Liberation Army, which is the largest army on the face of the earth. This is a period in which a pendulum swing to state capitalism is undoubtedly happening. I think John is right that the notion of a strong state and a free market seems to be being abandoned almost everywhere. And of course, China itself is something of a model of this new state capitalism. I do think one last and very important trend, which is part of this unsettled, undefined period, is the revival of civil societies, of the rise of groups and networks and citizens protesting against the arbitrary power, protesting against the despotic trends. You can see this, for instance, in the greatest uprising that's currently going on in the history of Serbia, where the issue is whether Serbia will be ruled by a despot, a demagogue, Vucic, or whether it will be a power-sharing constitutional rule of law democracy with an active civil society. There are anti-corruption initiatives everywhere. The Zondo Commission, for instance, in South Africa. And one should also add that there are expressions of the rejuvenation of the spirit of democracy in areas such as literature. Han Kang's Nobel Prize winning the South Korean novel Human Acts is a sort of wonderful expression of the non-violent spirit of democracy and the refusal of arbitrary power. And I would say, as part of these counter trends, what we're beginning to witness, whether they have a future or not, I can't be sure. But I'm thinking of initiatives like the Seville Platform for Action. This is a Spain-Brazil initiative that is calling for heavy taxation of the rich, debt forgiveness, climate redistribution of resources to deal with climate disasters, health crises, and so on. I think with the decline of the United States, I think we're going to see more of these initiatives. They're multilateral initiatives which are trying, as it were, to find a new global order. We'll see. I think, in short, we have here a handful of trends that are quite contradictory, but it's difficult at this point to say that there is one major outcome of this crisis of neoliberalism.
Now, to pick up on a theme that's been very strong in your presentation, John Kay, the decline of the United States, something I too have been writing about for the best part of 30 years, very evident to me on the military front, because there is no match between the awesome destructive capability at the disposal of the United States and the capacity to impose its will on different parts of the world. Just as its military power, by all measures, has been increasing, its capacity to impose its will has been diminishing. We need only think of Vietnam, Iraq, Syria, Libya, I mean, wherever it's been, a trail of Afghanistan, a trail of anywhere between disastrous and humiliating defeats. Okay, now, implications of this. What happens when an empire is declining, but refuses to accept its decline? That's, I think, one of the great and fascinating aspects of Trumpism. It acknowledges the decline. Why else would it say, let's make America great again, if it wasn't already great? So it acknowledges that it was once great, but not so great now. But it wants to make America great again against the odds, in my view. Now, that poses a major headache for the rest of the world. How do you contain the destructive capacity in democratic terms, in economic terms, and potentially in military terms, of a power, a major center still, that is declining, but somehow refuses to accept its decline? Rather than age with grace and elegance, it decides to put on a tantrum. How do you handle that? Open to both of you.
Do you want to start?
Yes. And how do the likes of Australia handle that? John, too.
Oh, well, I mean, I think Part of the issue, of course, is that this has happened very suddenly. I mean, I think I could reasonably count myself among the ultra pessimists as regards the second Trump administration, and I have been very much shown to be a Pollyanna as far as the actual outcomes have been. And this means, of course, nothing can be done gracefully. Well, as I say, certainly the US isn't doing it gracefully. The problem facing a country like Australia, which is arguably, even in some ways more than Canada, the closest ally of the US, the one that has almost invariably followed the US on the basis of a combination of sentiment and calculation. So the sentiment is that the US saved us in World War II, which we could argue about perhaps, but certainly that's an established as a given fact in the debate. And the calculation is that the second part of the sentiment is that we love democracy and the US is the beacon of democracy. And the third part is that the US will come to our aid should the need arise. So very clearly, the second of those is breaking down, but we still haven't had time to adjust to that. I mean, I haven't sort of parsed, for example, what our foreign minister says when she goes to China and speaks to her counterpart there. Presumably, it's relatively polite, but nothing like as effusive as what we see with Marco Rubio, the sort of humiliated offsider of Trump. So the assumption is that in some sense nothing has changed, but it's obvious that everything has changed. And I mean, I think I'll just to go on a bit. We're seeing it with Albanese making statements, his recent speech saying we have to be independent, but very clearly that isn't a choice that's available to us. That is, there's no sense in which Trump is going to tolerate an independent ally. You're either under the boot or you're at the end of it. And so so we have to find a way to back out of those things and find the alternatives. And really, of course, China is not in any way an attractive ally, but and for a long while, of course, the Labor Party had more of a policy of balancing between the powers while still being an ally of the US. I think we have to back away from all of the ties we have to the US, which are a great many. And we also, of course, as John Kay was saying, essentially we have a whole bunch of rule-created institutions centered on the US that have to be reconstructed simply because the US isn't interested in them. I mean, it's striking, for example, that the United Nations is still in New York, when obviously the Trump administration hates the United Nations far more effectively than any of its predecessors, has already withdrawn from a whole heap of multilateral institutions. Assuming we think the United Nations is something worth having, we need to move it back to Geneva or somewhere like that. And the same goes even for, I mean, I'll just give a very trivial example. I'm going to next year speak at a conference called the International Economic Association, which is set up by the UN, been around for 50 years, is essentially has eminent heads, but essentially entirely peripheral. All the action in the economics profession historically has been at the annual meetings of the American Economic Association. Well, that clearly can't continue. Large numbers of people who might want to go can't get in. Clearly, clearly all of those things have to be redone, and that's a process that takes an incredible number of years. To cancel a major international conference and start a new one is an incredibly long process. So many things need to be rebuilt. The alternative is to try and get, in some sense, established as a loyal protectorate of Trump. I can't see that working, but it'll be interesting to see, for example, what the New Zealand government, which is very much more sympathetic to Trump than our own, but is still not getting any good treatment, how they handle it. This process of disengagement, I think, is going to be the great task of, I guess, the next 5-10 years, however long Trump lives, however long his successors live after that. That task is going to be before us, unless we end up falling under the same paths as the Americans have done.
John, did you want to add something?
Yes, I think, if I may, the general rule, historically speaking, is that when empires are on the rise. And when their leadership is sufficiently wise, unlike the Nazis, whose empire lasted only a dozen years, there tends to be contradictory processes in which they secure their borderlands. In the case of China, Xinjiang and Tibet. And as they spread their economic, diplomatic, military, cultural power, there is a certain tendency to allow things to happen at a distance from the heartlands of the empire. There is, in other words, a kind of recognition of the limits of imperial rule, and this generosity, if I could put it like that, I think we're seeing in the case of China. And I want to say something to John about what John Q just had to say in a moment. The reverse trend in which empires are in decline, typically the pattern is they're paranoid, they're riddled with anxiety, they are prone to revenge, and as a last-ditch effort, permanently are at war. This is a period, it seems to me, in which the Kissinger rule applies. You may know that he famously said that to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. I think this rule certainly applies to Australia and to other democracies in this period. I do think that the question of how to manage an empire in decline is a kind of uncharted territory. There's not a lot written about this. Maxine has made a remark or asked a question about, did Britain decline gracefully? According to this general rule, the short answer is no. Ask the Kenyans what they think of the early 1950s when the British did what empires in decline do, which is during the Mau Mau uprising, you may have read, 1 million people were put in concentration camps by the British in order to stave off the struggle for independence. On China, just if I may, Joe, a few remarks. I mean, if I'm right about the emergence of China as a new global empire of a kind the world has never witnessed before, I call it a galaxy empire. We don't have time to discuss why I talk about it in that way, but it does seem to me clear that with a whole range of global problems, cross-border problems, cooperation with China will be necessary. Let me give you an example or several examples. Almost surely, the United States will try to wreck the WTO. The first Trump administration tried to do it. Australia, Canada, Chile, and other countries joined with China when Trump tried to kill the WTO by destroying its appellate court, the dispute resolution court, and did so successfully by setting up a parallel court that rescued the WTO from oblivion. Or another example, in Montreal, the world's first biodiversity agreement was reached several years ago. 30% of lands and later seas are to be protected by global agreement from further so-called development. China was the president of that meeting. The United States was one of the few who voted, who abstained from supporting that initiative. The American diplomats said, you know, we can't get it through Congress, so we will simply abstain. Australia supported that initiative. So what I'm saying is that this emergent Chinese empire should not be demonized. It should not be seen as simply an unattractive option, as John Q said. It seems to me that a nuanced view in this strange, discombobulated period, a nuanced view of China and how to extract agreements with the Chinese through diplomacy and so on, is of utmost importance. And one last remark about our little country. It seems to me that one of the weaknesses of the whole political class is their inability to think like Singapore or Vietnam in their ability to play off two great powers, one in decline and one emerging. I'm hoping that one of the things we'll learn, thanks to Trump, is the art of diplomacy, the art of being able to play off an empire in decline, stave off its most noxious effects with cooperation with China on a number of key matters.
Mhm.
If I could jump quickly, I mean, we need to not only, I think, position ourselves more like Singapore and Vietnam, but join them, except that we are an Asian country. We can't do that as long as we have as long as we're seen, of course, Howard actually used the words deputy sheriff, as long as we're seen as a loyal ally of the US, that can't happen. And so once it does, I think when you look at the countries in our region, the capacity to play off China and the US is very great. That is, we're a large group of countries, a substantial population, a group of economies comparable in many ways to the EU, particularly if India can emerge from Modiism and become, it obviously wants to be a counterweight to China in some ways, but also is in the grip of Trumpism itself. You have the potential to play a very different role to what we've had. Regarding China, I think one thing I would add, which is possibly not, I mean, I don't think is necessarily admirable, but is beneficial for us, is unlike the great empires we've seen, it's always been, I think, very contemptuous of the rest of the world. When the Europeans sent gifts of various kinds, mechanical clocks and so forth, the Chinese emperor said, we have no need for that. We have no need for these toys. China is much less interested, I think, in exporting its way of life to the rest of the world than previous empires have been. Beyond, as you say, securing its borders, which of course in that context includes Taiwan, as well as the places it already actually controls. But there's just seems to be very little interest in China. And the second thing where it wants control is over the Chinese diaspora. So essentially, if you're not Chinese, really, I think the Chinese view is they don't care about you.
Okay, well, I have one final thing to put to you. We've taken a bit longer than we had programmed, but that's okay because I think it's a very interesting conversation, and we'll open it up for Q&A shortly. Taking Australia as an example, what you're both suggesting is that Australia will need, if it is to rise to the challenge, to reconcile its history with its geography. And of course, its geography is primarily in the Asia-Pacific, it's overwhelmingly in the Asia-Pacific region. Its history is with the Anglosphere. Okay, but to do this requires vision, boldness, and a sense of initiative. In the case of Australia, it seems to me at least, most unlikely to come from the major parties, either of the two major parties. It's unlikely to surface in a significant way in the near future, at least, or even the foreseeable future in the Australian Parliament. So if there is to be, on that front, and on the whole question of democratizing decision-making in this country, if the initiative, the vision, the boldness is unlikely to come from the established major parties, which, as I think John Q said, is now relying on a decreasing proportion of the electorate, where is the initiative, the vision, and the boldness to come from? Are there glimmers of hope that you can detect?
I'll give a couple of points. The first is, I think, although we haven't seen it yet, I mean, we had, on the whole, for good reasons, namely a rejection of Trumpism, a big majority for the current government when the expectation was that they would lose their majority. But I think I think we're going to see the end of majority party government in Australia as the norm, as we're already seeing, I think, in lots of places. So I think that will help to open things up. I guess my judgment is that it's not so much going to be initiative and boldness on our part as a series of forced moves. That is, Albanese, we have AUKUS as this prize dangled in front of us, but the price keeps on going up. And I can't see, in particular, very clearly, I think, the kind of statement Albanese's made on Sunday essentially says that as regards a war with China, Australia will make up its own mind. And the essence of US policy is they're not going to give any submarines, any of their precious submarines, to a country that might not be there on the day that Trump says we have to go to war. I think that logic says Trump will keep on upping the ante, and any kind of resistance in the end will push us away from them. So I'm seeing the process as being driven by boldness and vision, if you like, on the other side of the Pacific, that Trump has a vision where he calls the shots and everybody else jumps. And even the most moderate resistance, I think, will push even a very weak government like Albanese's away eventually in the direction of resistance. That's at least my take.
But John, with the widespread support of the Australian public, or fear and anxiety on the part of the Australian public?
Both. I think if you look at opinion, I had a fight with the Lowy Institute about this, slightly. They had a poll which said they had one poll which said people hate Trump, which I think is very clear, and the election result showed that people hate and fear Trump. Still, people haven't, I think, the kind of things that John Kay was talking about. People's image of America hasn't adjusted to the fact that A, that Trump is going to be there forever, and B, that the majority of Americans, and particularly the overwhelming majority of white American men, the archetypal Americans you see on the TV, back Trump. Those two facts haven't cohered in the public mind. There was another interesting point, which was they said, should Australia, they asked people, should Australia have nuclear-powered submarines? They reported it as, do Australians support AUKUS, which is, I mean, I'm not a believer that nuclear-powered submarines are a good idea, but it reflects the fact the political class, including the Lowy Institute, is still very much stuck in this frame of mind of, even more so than the public as a whole, this belief that Trump is a nightmare which will soon go away. And I think that those contradictions are there, unsurprisingly, because this has only been a few months. I mean, the kind of image is a marriage which has been going on sort of okay for quite a while, and suddenly the man turns nasty and threatening and violent. You start by trying to sweet talk them, hoping things will go away. Then you start getting your bags ready, but you still have all the reasons why you're not going to go. We're in that kind of stage, I think, with the US. The sort of daddy talk that Mark Rutte was putting up absolutely puts that metaphor right in place.
John Kay, in asking you to make some comments, could I preface it by saying, do you see in the Western world generally, and particularly in the so-called liberal democracy of Europe, Canada, Australia, any sense arising in the public sphere outside of political parties, whether it be the so-called intelligentsia or activist groups, social movements, where there's serious rethinking going on, not just about this policy or that policy, but the wider issues that both of you have been discussing?
Yes, I think this is a period in which to be an optimist is to be a bloody fool, but to be a pessimist is to paralyze ourselves. And I think, I jokingly describe myself as a possimist. This is a bit of an in-joke because possum in Latin is, I can do. We also know possums in our back gardens can play dead and do remarkable things. I mean, possumism is obviously, if it's for me, one of the sources of resilience in this strange and difficult period. I think John Q's remarks about Trump and the sort of demonstration effect of Trump, in that, his delivering blows to an empire that's already in decline. I think that's right. I do think that the continuities between Trump and previous presidents would be another very interesting discussion. This is not just, a new rupture. Tariff policies were engineered, Trump's were engineered by Biden, for instance. Wars have been going on thanks to the imperial presidency without congressional support for many decades, and so on. I'd say immediately to your question, Joe, that when it comes to big generalization, EU, Canada, Australia, I think this is a period in which actually there are signs emerging of a renewal of the democratic imagination among citizens, among networks and organizations. There's certainly a great intellectual interest in this field. The sense that these are very difficult times in which building democracy hideaways and havens and hermitages are very important. And I myself am interested in and trying to write at the moment about a very old-fashioned topic, the spirit of democracy. It was Montesquieu in the 18th century who wrote a very famous and very important book on the spirit of the laws. I'm interested in this category of spirit. It has Christian qualities, but all cultures have a word to describe the shared sentiments, the feelings that people carry, so to say, in their bodies. And Montesquieu, in particular, told the story to illustrate the importance of spirit and the importance of keeping it alive under difficult circumstances. In his case, the fear of despotism. He told the story of a Venetian trader who traveled all the way to Pegu on what is today the coast of Myanmar. And there in Pegu, he meets the emperor. And the emperor's first question to the trader is, what kind of ruler do you have in Venice? And the trader says, we do not have a monarch. And the emperor begins to laugh so riotously that he almost chokes on his own laughter. He's so astonished that there could be a polity without a single ruler. The point that Montesquieu was developing, and I think needs to be developed, is to ask ourselves, what is this spirit of democracy and why is it important? Well, in my view, I spent most of my life writing, sad life, writing about the past, present, and future of democracy. I mean, democracy is much more than free and fair periodic elections. It is about the spirit of equalization of life chances. It is about the problem of arbitrary power and the way that when power is unchecked, it's dangerous and it typically becomes foolish or catastrophic in its effects. And it seems to me that one of the consequences of this end of the era of neoliberalism, of the rise of demagogues, the securing of despotisms, Russia, the Central Asian republics, and so on, is to rekindle, I think, this old question of what's so good about democracy. If none of this appeals to our friends who are with us tonight, the retort, I think, is, okay, if you are not for power sharing, if you are not for the constraint of power, not only through elections, but through watchdog bodies of one kind or another, integrity commissions, anti-corruption bodies, and so on, then you have to believe in good kings and queens. And I think in these years of the 21st century, this option of believing that power will be benevolent, that unchecked power will always bring gifts to people, is actually nonsense. And this is a moment, in other words, in which it seems to me that these basic questions, which were last discussed in the 1940s, when there was the last great big debate about the future of democracy, and it was a global debate, this deserves, I think, a renewal, a renaissance.
That's a good note on which to then proceed to the next important segment of our discussions, which is a Q&A. But before doing that, Emily, if you're there, can we show a couple of slides which point to certain things that are coming up, which are not altogether unrelated? Okay, as you know, before I go to artificial intelligence, very quickly for the benefit of everyone who may not know, we have made a commitment as Conversation at the Crossroads to try and promote the idea of participatory democracy. And towards that, we had a small but important, nevertheless, experiment in a citizen assembly, which was held just over a month ago. And this is something we wish to continue. So the idea of developing not just ideas, but practices of participatory democracy is going to be a very important item on our agenda for not only the rest of this year, but going into next year and beyond. And this conversation is very much part of that. But we're going to have another event, which is primarily aimed at those who live in the city of Melbourne, as part of a series we've had for the best part of 2 years now, called Big Ideas in the Pub. We have discussed democracy head-on. In this case, we are going to discuss one of the new technologies, which is causing a lot of concern and much thought, is artificial intelligence, because it poses the question, who will make the decisions, who is making the decisions, and who will make them in whose interest as these advanced technologies take root. So if any of the people who are attending this event have who live in Melbourne and have any interest in this larger question of the relationship of advanced technologies, artificial intelligence in this case, and decision making, and some of the philosophical implications of all this, I strongly recommend to you Reckoning with Artificial Intelligence, which will be hosted by Tim Adelin, whom you see on the right of your screen, with his guest, who will be Matt Cooperholz. Okay, and the next item I wanted to mention very quickly is some resources which we are putting together. The first is a series of interviews, 4 interviews I had with 4 outstanding intellectuals discussing the violence in the Middle East and the ethical implications of all that. You can find all this on the Conversation at the Crossroads website. Each interview is roughly half an hour. Professor Professor Amin Saikal, Helen Coburn, who's based in Washington, Tilman Ruff, who is the founder of ICANN, the Nobel Peace Prize Initiative, and Richard Falk, a well-known scholar and public intellectual who has played a key role and was UN rapporteur for human rights in the occupied territories. So 4, I think, very interesting interviews that you may wish to look at and share with others who may also be interested. Do we have anything on coming soon? Yes, we do. It is a series of podcasts which Emily is helping to put together with others, called Real Stories, Global Issues, Human Security Redefined. And I expect some of these podcasts will go to air somewhere over the next several weeks, and there'll be a number of them beginning with issues to do with the legacies of the nuclear weapon and nuclear power more generally. Okay, now for Q&A, I've asked Eddie Kowalski to keep a close eye on the Q&A and the chats, the questions that have been put there by various people. And so he will share with us some questions, which will then will be addressed to our 2 guests to respond.
I think, Joe, please allow the audience to actually put some questions in there. We've had comments, but not so much direct questions so far.
All right. Well, are there any comments which might provoke some response?
Okay, so one's just come in that's very interesting. Do either of the speakers think that Israel and the US bombed Iran as part of a plan to destabilize the global economy and undermine BRICS countries to keep the US dollar dominant?
John Q, you're muted.
Look, I think Trump is doing everything he can to destroy the dominance of the US dollar. And I mean, the kind of conspiracy theories about this, I think, just aren't right. A first point to make is that the dominance of the US dollar isn't the big asset that a lot of people think it is. It's a useful tool for the US, but it's by no means super important. But the second point is that the things Trump is doing will destroy not only the particular appeal of the US dollar, but the whole US financial system, the credibility of the financial system. So the idea that he has some Machiavellian plot in which in some way dropping a bomb in Iran is going to, I can't work out the steps in between, but I think this isn't really the way things are going to happen. I don't even think BRICS is really, it's a collection after all, includes India and China, who in most respects are at daggers drawn. It's a bunch of countries that are disaffected with the US in various ways. But I guess I'd say in most of this stuff, all the damages are being done by Trump within the US. The actions of other countries are really third order.
If I may, Joe.
Yes.
I think that, that theory, it's too conspiratorial for my taste. I do think that one key way to understand the attack on Iran is offered by Jeffrey Sachs, that, the United States has for several decades been the tail wagged by the Israeli dog.
Yep.
And we know from the crucial leak that there has been anxiety in the Trump cabinet group that Israel, is getting ahead of itself, getting too big for its boots and so on. One ironic positive consequence of the United States now being bogged down in yet another war zone, the other is Ukraine, is that the pivot to Asia I think is unlikely to happen. That might be very good news for this country. Fighting 3 wars simultaneously and being foolish enough to try to provoke a conflict with China, well, it would be suicidal. On the US dollar, I think John Q is right that there is a long-term set of challenges to the US dollar system. And there are various sources. The Chinese reliance on deals, investment, and cross-border trade using the renminbi is a case in point. In 2023, for the first time, the majority of trade, Chinese trade with the world, it's the world's largest trading power, was done in renminbi, not in US dollars. And there is, I think, growing nervousness among dollar holders about the future of the dollar system. There is some sort of low-level movement to multi-currency baskets. And if the Trump administration was so foolish, Lighthizer is one of them pushing this foolish idea to tax treasuries. This would result in a very large flight from the US dollar, which has very serious implications for a declining empire that is hugely in debt. And this beautiful bill that has just been passed will add, well, just another $1 trillion or so to what is already, I think, $35 or $36 trillion debt. This is not sustainable in the long run.
Eddie,
Yep.
there have been some other questions?
Yes, they have. So I think there are 2 that have a similar theme, and they talk to the influence of special interests. And the questions are, what do you think about the potential for a transition to a corporate-run America, i.e. Corporatocracy, if their economy needs to be saved by tech oligarchs? So that's the question. And the other question, which I think is related, is around Israel's ability to have power and say in certain Western democracies more than others, in particular, let's say in America. And the question is why the Israeli or Zionist lobby groups are so powerful in America.
If I could comment, I mean, I think the first question is actually the opposite of the truth. And we've seen this with Musk and Trump, and we've seen it before in Russia. Once you and we saw it with Hitler and Hugenberg, for example. We've seen a long series of situations where major business people put up a demagogue and think, well, we can control this guy, he'll do our bidding. And most of those people, if they're lucky, end up in quiet retirement in a village without any of their assets. The unlucky ones end up falling out of high windows. And Musk, we've seen this already with Musk. People imagine that Musk is this incredibly powerful person. Trump is already threatening him with deportation to South Africa, and who is to stop him? So I think what's striking about the demagogic system is really it's not the corporates, it's the chances, the people who've made their money by being in the right, made a lot of money individually by being at the right place at the right time. Clive Palmer, Gina Reinhart, people like this, they're not people who have, who in general have worked their way up through a large corporate system. They're people who have bought the right mining lease at the right time. And so I don't think the corporate part of the story, my view, I guess, really, and I mean, this is essentially just a cultural fact, is you're better off thinking of the US and Israel as a single polity, that the same, that effectively, Israel is part of the US political system with essentially veto power over US foreign policy. I think we're seeing that now played out with pressure on all other countries. But of course, one something that I haven't really seen resolved is that there's this big divide outside the US between elite opinion and elite policy, which is still Israel is one of the family of democracies, and and any criticism of Israel is highly problematic, combined with public attitudes which are much less favourable.
May I say a few words?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think that the pattern of restructuring of power, the kind of regime type that demagogues give birth to, is technically to be described as, I'm trying to finish a book on this at this very moment, technically to be described as despotism. Phantom democracies. So what happens? You see this in Orban's Hungary. Kaczynski was trying to do this in Poland. Vucic did it in Serbia. The whole of the Central Asian republics, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when they had elections, gave rise to demagogues who, to repeat, neutered the judiciary. They stack it. They change the constitution, or they stack it with their own men, typically men. They tame the parliament. They have the army, intelligence, and police forces on their side. They politicize the state bureaucracy. They destroy independent media. And yet, unlike the fascism of the 20th century, they actually like elections and depend upon elections because it confirms, in their view, that the people, are in favor of this regime and its concentration of power. And one of the features of these new despotisms is the emergence of crystallization of what the Hungarians call oligarchy. That means big business types become integrated with government, and government itself becomes involved in business. It's a form of state capitalism in which, of course, the rich who are protected by that despotism flourish. And there is a growing gap between rich and poor and so on, but constant talk of the people, constant talk of democracy, and the importance of elections as part of this narrative. That seems to me to be one of the very gravest dangers facing us in these years of the 21st century. And it seems to me that Trump, it's almost as if he's read the playbook. It's exactly what he's doing. Whether it can be undone, well, this will be decided not only by judicial resistance, but it will have to come from below, from civil society. On Israel, I think John Mearsheimer's book on the Israel lobby tells us a great deal about the extraordinary influence of this lobby on American foreign policy. It's a lobby that operates in many countries. It's a lobby that can produce a dampening of scholarly curiosity and freedom of expression within universities. I'll give you one example. There was a controversy during the past year that was stirred up in some parts of the mainstream media about a course in government and international relations at the University of Sydney, which listed John Mearsheimer's book. And the accusation was, this is anti-Semitism. Everybody went to ground. And I can tell you that I myself am now caught up in a very high profile case, which is going to go before the federal court, which is about exactly this issue. The claim is that I and a colleague in the University of Sydney are peddling racial hatred, meaning that to criticize Israel is synonymous with anti-Semitism. It's a load of nonsense, but I'm afraid this is a trend that has taken root in all kinds of situations and countries. Germany is probably the most extreme case. What the applicants in this case that I'm facing are trying to do, to put it very simply, is to turn Australia into Germany, so that no institution from primary, secondary schools, universities, the public service, businesses, NGOs, would be able to criticize, would tolerate dissent on this matter, that they would not
And
allow
John, you could add media to that, huh?
as well. That to criticize Israel would be, if they win this case, would be considered racial hatred. It's absurd. And we could have a whole long discussion about the implications of this case. But it seems to me that this lobby is losing. And it's losing because of the horrific violence, the barbarity of what is going on in Gaza and the West Bank, in southern Lebanon. And this is not going to go away.
Thank you so much, both. We've got one more final question, I think.
Okay.
And this is around what you both think about the use of citizen assemblies, especially ones that might be grassroots organized and bottom up, as a way to address these very serious challenges that we face in our democracy.
Either of you?
John Q.
Well, I mean, I guess I'm sort of generally positively disposed, but not really convinced we're going to get very far by trying, in some sense, to mimic a parliament. I suppose. I mean, I think our only experience with this was at the time, as a serious exercise, was at the time of the Republic referendum, and that was a schmozzle. I think I mean, what we saw, I guess, there was essentially that the organised group, which was Malcolm Turnbull and the Republican movement, were able to push their preferred model through the Citizens' Assembly, even though it turned out to be a political loser. That almost certainly we would have done better pushing for a direct elected president. So I guess I'm not convinced that we makes much of an advance on the way in which we've historically organised things, which is groups organised around specific issues with a goal, as opposed to an attempt to reach some kind of much broader group. I suppose also my long experience on social media has sort of conditioned me to the view that reaching out across the aisle is generally not a very good idea. That it's very discussion with a broad range of people is very difficult to sustain without just breaking down into kind of factionalism you see in politics. So my general thought is, it seems like a nice idea, but I don't really know how to make it work.
Yeah, I mean, I have some sympathy for the Citizens' Assembly notion. It's a Greek idea originally. You know, the idea is that democracy is quintessentially the gathering of people who consider each other equals in relatively small groups, where they decide to put a stone in a pot or raise their hands. And they decide matters of great importance, you know, whether to increase taxes or reduce taxes, or to go to war or to strike a peace accord. The problem, it seems to me, with there is a handful of problems with the Citizen Assembly, or at least the attempt to universalize citizen assemblies as the sort of core mechanism of a rejuvenated democracy. Scalability is one problem. You know, all very well at the very local level. For example, the two citizens' assemblies that were held in my native South Australia about the future of nuclear waste. But how to scale that up to the global level, for example, is very unclear. There is also, running through the literature and the defenders of citizens' assemblies, a kind of, it's Jürgen Habermas influence. It's this idea that rational seminar style communication is desirable and is always possible, Well, if you've been to a public meeting, you'll know that that's rarely the case, and it's one of the joys of public assemblies that there's rough and tumble. There's also, it seems to me, a kind of amnesia built into the Citizens' Assembly idealized model of democracy. This is a long story, but what goes missing in the Citizens' Assembly model is the importance of representative mechanisms. You know, that there is this notion of direct face-to-face democracy in citizens' assemblies. But actually, at the end of the 18th century, the world invented another understanding of democracy as the election, the choosing, the free choosing of representatives who for a time would govern. I mean, that is not going to go away so long as we have elections and political parties. And not only that, but it seems to me that the Citizens' Assembly model suffers amnesia in another sense. In my own view, in the work I've tried to write about the history of democracy, something really important happened in the 1940s. The reimagining of democracy, which meant not only citizens' participation, not only free and fair elections, but the importance of watchdog mechanisms. I call it monitory democracy. You know, the great importance of anti-corruption commissions, of truth and reconciliation bodies. I mean, more than 100 new types of power monitoring, watchdog, barking dog institutions have been invented since the 1940s globally, and none of these existed before in the history of democracy. So the defense of democracy in these difficult times, in these years of the 21st century, cannot be done only through the defense of citizens' assemblies. Free and fair elections in which big money is moved out, in which there is an attempt to elect Mamdani type figures running, you know, for the New York mayorship, and the defense and building of new watchdog, barking dog institutions that can blow the whistle on arbitrary power, on the corrupt. These, it seems to me, are other mechanisms that must be part of the renewal of democracy and the prevention of the spread of arbitrary power, which seems to me to be going on in these years.
Thanks, John.
Briefly,
Thank you, the two Johns. Now, before I ask both of you for
one very quick point, which is...
yes, John Q.
Trumpists, a lot of them, those who imagine themselves to be high-toned, often quote the saying that the US is a republic, not a democracy. What that originally meant was precisely the distinction that John's drawing. That is, the US has a representative system, a republic, as opposed to the crowd, the entire crowd, all the adult male citizens getting together and deciding things. And so that distinction is when the founders of the US were saying it's not a democracy, what they meant is precisely that what you do is elect representatives who deliberate as opposed to a massive public assembly. So,
yes,
it's interesting to hear Bob Carr speak on this. He says the US is not a democracy, it's at best a republic, and not a particularly democratic one. But that's a big issue for another time. We're going to do, I'm going to call on both of you to make a very brief closing comment in a minute, and possibly the kind of comment that might lift the spirits a little bit, but that's up to you. But we're going to conduct two quick polls that will take very little time. Two questions that we're going to put to all assembled. So here is the first one, and you're able to submit your answer. Various principles have been suggested as key to the notion of participatory democracy, and some of them are put there: effective citizen participation, political equality, transparency in governance and decision-making, public accountability, which is what John Kay has just been talking about, and the notion of tolerance and acceptance of diverse media and public interest journalism as one of its important foundation stones. Now, how strongly do you support these principles, very broadly put, and different people might want to emphasize different ones, but broadly speaking, do you feel you support them very strongly, just moderately, not at all, or you're just not sure? So please go ahead and submit your answer and we'll see what happens.
Are the speakers entitled to vote?
Yes, you can. Emily, are people doing it?
Yes, question 1, 100% is answered, Joe.
And what does it say?
It is saying that 79% of people very strongly agree with the principles, 16% strongly agree, 4% moderately, and 0% are either unsure or not at all supportive.
Okay. Let's put up the next question.
The next question is visible for all if you just scroll down the poll ever so slightly.
Yes.
Read that ahead, Joe.
Okay. It simply says that we at Conversation at the Crossroads are very interested in promoting the principles that we've just been referring to in some form or other.
Can't see it.
You scroll down from the first question, scroll down, and you'll see the second question.
It disappeared, Joe.
What?
The first question, once submitted, is gone.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah,
Well,
it's gone.
you should now have the second question.
No.
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 No, well, there's no.
Not here.
No.
No, it's nothing's there at all. Nothing.
Nothing showing.
Emily,
No,
I could see.
Yeah.
there
Thank
is.
you.
Yep. Come up. Yep.
Okay. So the second question is, assuming, as we think we will, Conversation at the Crossroads wants to spend some time and energy on pursuing some of these ideas and principles. Do you see yourself likely to be engaged, very strongly, moderately, not at all, or unsure?
This is the same question.
No,
Scroll
this is a
down.
practical question
Oh, sorry.
about your personal engagement
I got it. Yeah.
in support of those principles.
I got the first question again, as if I hadn't signed it, and then submitted it again. I couldn't scroll down to the second question. It wouldn't scroll.
Don't worry unduly. It doesn't really matter, so long as most people can now see the question number 2.
We've got 85% of people have been able to respond.
And what are they saying?
Very, very mixed thoughts. We have around, it's buffering as we're getting a few more responses. 21% of people are very strongly supportive of such an initiative, 42% strongly, 25% moderately, 9% unsure, and 4% not at all.
Okay, well, thank you for that. That gives us some idea of the lay of the land, at least so far as this gathering is concerned, and it's useful to take into account for future planning. Okay, well, let's now call on our 2 guests for some concluding remarks, brief, and whatever you think is appropriate at this time in the course of the conversation we've been having. John Kay, would you like to go first this time?
Sure. My parting shots are probably, there are probably 3 of them. I think the poll doesn't quite capture what is a more widespread trend in democracies, so named democracies, which is the spread of indifference. Jonathan Glazer's wonderful film Zone of Interest, I mean, has raised that issue. there is a lot of poll evidence of millions of people who not only are disaffected with democracy, but actually indifferent. And you know, indifference is not ignorance. Indifference requires a lot of internal work with ourselves. We have to zone out from things that we find disgusting or distasteful. And it's a real problem, I think, in matters of democracy as to how to sort of break this indifference and how to arouse a sense of responsibility among people for the things that are going on around them, from household all the way through to battlefields in far distant lands. That's a point about indifference. Second, I wanted to quote earlier one of my favorite remarks of C.S. Lewis, the children's novelist, the great Irish writer, who in the darkest period of World War II wrote an essay on democracy, in which he said very controversially, you know, Democrats of the past, suppose that people are good enough to govern themselves, and that's why we don't need tyrants and monarchs and despots and oligarchs and so on. Actually, it's not true. The reason why democracy is a good thing is that nobody is good enough to be permanently trusted with the exercise of power. I mean, that's for me a saying that is close to my heart, and it seems to me to be of great pertinence in this period of the 21st century. And one last parting remark, if I may, Joe. You know, there was a very brief discussion tonight about ecology and democracy and neoliberalism. I've been thinking about this for most of my life, and I wanted to just say, as my parting shot, that one thing that has happened in my lifetime that is new in the history of democracy and should encourage us is the growing rejection of democracy as the most homocentric political ideal ever invented. What could be more homocentric than the view that the people living on Earth, on this planet, are entitled to govern themselves as sovereign and to do whatever they wish on this planet? One big change that has been going on, it's unfinished, it's for me a positive and encouraging trend, and it's global, is the extension of, is the redefinition of democracy. Democracy is the self-government of people who consider themselves as equals, but people who are aware that they are entangled with biowebs, with ecosystems, and that the fragility of those ecosystems and the damage that is being done to them can be reversed by extending the right of representation of the biosphere into human affairs. It's not just green parties, it's bioregional assemblies, it's cross-border agreements, the Montreal agreement I mentioned earlier. I mean, this trend is, I think, of vital importance. It's something new in the history of democracy, and it's alive and well in this country and elsewhere.
John Q?
Sure. Well, to end with something optimistic, if I could manage to turn off all the world news, I would actually be pretty happy about the prospects of democracy. As I say, the big parties have lost their grip in most places, and on the whole, the people who've pushed them aside have been better. We had our upsurge of demagoguery with Pauline Hanson 25 years ago, and I mean she's still there, of course, but never troubles the scorers more than 8% of the vote or so. We've got I mean, not a great integrity commission, but we have all those institutions, and people seem to be behaving in the way that democratic theory would suggest they ought to. We haven't, well, I would certainly like to see the government be a bit more active on a whole bunch of fronts, but again, I think the electoral process is sort of pushing them in the right direction. So that says and the further point is, I mean, we haven't really talked about it, but I mean, the big thing driving the far right is immigration policy. And there, of course, we have an appalling record with asylum seekers. But on the other hand, we also have 30% of the population born overseas, which is something which the theorists of anti-immigration would suggest couldn't possibly go along with a stable and happy society. So I think Australia has so far shown it can be done reasonably well. Perhaps we can continue to do better.
Thank you. I want to thank both of you for your presentations and for what I think is a contribution to a very important contribution to a more enlightened discussion of the challenges we face and the possible responses to those challenges. And it seems to me that critical, and we haven't discussed this much, to the future of democracy is the role of education, the degree to which new generations are equipped to understand something about the spirit of democracy and to be able to make judgments when practice falls short of the spirit. So that's, in a nutshell, the contribution, which in a small way, just a pebble in a large pond, conversation at the crossroads wants to make, to try and create, to raise in some way the level of the public conversation, both about the challenges and the potential responses. So thank you again, John Q and John K, for your marvelous contribution. And we look forward to catching up with your future comments and writings in the months and years ahead. So thank you, and thank you to all of those who have attended, to Emily and to Eddie for helping to put this session together. And we look forward to seeing you in the not too distant future at some other event as part of some other activity. So thank you and take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.